I wonder where this whole shame is coming from on an individual level and also on a collective level.
And really what it is, it's the capacity to see yourself through someone else's eyes and sort of judge yourself according to a standard or a norm or a rule or something. So this is a kind of universal experience. We're going to experience shame. And actually, social theorists talk about shame as being the master emotion, because through shame experiences or negative self-conscious experiences, we learn social norms. We learn what's right or wrong or appropriate or inappropriate. And therefore, we learn how to fit in and stay in our social group. And if we didn't have those experiences, we wouldn't survive, because we're social animals and we need others to look after us in order to survive. And the threat in shame is the threat that you'll be rejected or ostracized, and therefore you won't survive. So it's like a really primal emotion about survival. So shame is kind of always there. What might trigger shame can vary from culture to culture.
What's the connection between shame and silence or not talking about shame?
It's true, shame itself is shameful and taboo. So it's one of these experiences that it's uncomfortable to talk about. Nobody wants to admit to feeling shame. Nobody wants to acknowledge shame when it's happening. If you see someone embarrassed or ashamed, you pretend it's not happening. And I think because it's so threatening to our sense of self, like underneath shame is a fear of being rejected by others, a fear of not being good enough, a fear of failure. There's a deep vulnerability in shame. And it becomes, therefore, even more taboo. And like it can then be very triggering or upsetting to confront.
You mentioned a few more systemic factors of shame.
So there are lots of like political dimensions to shame, even though we experience it as a kind of individual, personal emotion. It feels like it's just my problem and it's just my fault and it's just me experiencing this. It's very often connected to bigger like social patterns and norms. So thinking about how certain groups are positioned in society to be more likely to be the recipients of shame and shaming. So their position is worth less. And this can fall along the lines of gender or race or sexuality or ethnicity. And it's not that the person themselves has anything to feel shame about, but that they're positioned as shameworthy by certain norms or structures within society. And then it becomes an emotion of social control, because when you use shame, people want to avoid shame at all costs. So if you're weaponizing shame, it means that you can get people to do things that they might not want to do, or try and be a certain way, even if it's not in line with who they really are. Shame is often hidden by other experiences. I talked about the shame compass. So what we often experience when we're encountering other people is not their shame, but their defense against shame. So it's like learning to see behind these surface behaviors to the emotional distress that might be driving them. So if you suspect someone's experiencing shame, like how can you be sensitive to their experience?
Hi, and welcome back to New World in Making. Today I'm speaking with Luna Dolezal, Professor of Philosophy and Medical Humanities, and one of the leading researchers on shame. She's truly an expert in understanding this emotion, one that shapes actually so much of our inner lives and our societies, and yet remains one of the least acknowledged and least understood. That's why I've been looking forward to this conversation a lot, because shame is so powerful and it influences how we show up, how we relate, how we limit ourselves, and even how we build our social worlds. And still we rarely talk about it. So I'm deeply curious about what lies beneath shame and what we are actually ashamed of. Why does it hold so much power over us? And what happens when we begin to name it and understand it, or even question it? This is one of those conversations that really, I believe, helps lift the veil so we can see more clearly what we feel, where those feelings come from, and what they reveal about us as individuals and as a collective. So let's dive in. Thanks, Luna, for being here. It's really an honor to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm very curious about what we're going to talk about today. That's shame. But before we go into that, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into the place that you're in today and why shame?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I am an academic. I work at the University of Exeter as an academic philosopher. So I'm professor of philosophy and medical humanities. And I've been researching shame, for over 20 years. I wrote my MA thesis about shame and then my PhD thesis about shame. And I was studying philosophy when I did my MA and PhD. And I was very interested in phenomenology, which is philosophy of first person experience, and also in social constructivism, which is another theory that talks about how humans are shaped by social forces. And those two theories seemed kind of at odds because phenomenology talks about how the human subject is like an agent in the world and constitutes the world, whereas social constructivism talks about how the human is written by society and has no agency and will. And so this is a kind of very theoretical way to talk about how I got to shame, because I saw shame as the thing that linked those two accounts together. So within a shame experience are folded in social norms. So we experience shame on a first person level, and that experience carries into us social norms. So we learn what's right or wrong or acceptable or unacceptable because of the shame and the standards by which we feel shame. So I wrote my PhD thesis about this. It was called The Body Shaped by Shame. And I was really interested in how understanding how like we get norms inside us and then shape our behavior, maybe even shape our bodies. And I even wrote about cosmetic surgery, so where the body is literally shaped by shame because of shame dynamics that might play out between mostly women and society, or women and clinicians who are doing aesthetic procedures. And so I've been researching shame for a long time, and part of that journey was realizing that I was sort of researching something that I was also experiencing myself. So as a woman in late maternity, body shame is obviously something that is central to my experience, as it is to all women's experiences. So I thought this is like deeply personal, but also political and also kind of theoretically very interesting to bring different accounts within philosophy together.
Wow, it's so fascinating because I feel that we barely talk about shame, isn't it? It's not something
Yeah.
that you discuss publicly a lot. What's the connection between shame and silence or not talking about shame?
Yeah, no, that's a great comment and observation. And it's true, shame itself is shameful and taboo. So it's one of these experiences that it's uncomfortable to talk about. Nobody wants to admit to feeling shame.
Mm.
Nobody
Yeah.
wants to acknowledge shame when it's happening. If you see someone embarrassed or ashamed, you pretend it's not happening. And I think because it's so threatening to our sense of self, like underneath shame is a fear of being rejected by others, a fear of not being good enough, a fear of failure. There's a deep vulnerability in shame, and that makes it shameful. So to admit to shame is to kind of admit that, yeah, there's something wrong with me, or maybe I should be rejected. And so we will go to great lengths to avoid and hide shame. And we do that individually, but we also do it collectively and socially. So in our culture, people don't really speak openly about shame, don't learn to recognize shame experiences or to speak about them. And it becomes therefore even more taboo, and like it can then be very triggering or upsetting to confront because it's such a kind of sensitive, it's become so sensitive.
Right.
Mhm.
No, totally. And what are these main, I would say, main areas where you identified shame? Like you already were speaking about female bodies, motherhood, kind of how it changes with motherhood, the body. Where are there other areas where we experience shame on an individual level and also as a collective?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question, and I think shame is everywhere. So it's in all aspects of human life, to be honest. But
Yes.
there are certainly certain things that um, make sure shame more dominant. So where there are really exacting or punishing social norms or expectations. So I think for women, there are like really strong norms around appearance and femininity and how what's appropriate in terms of how you look and how you behave. And then you're very easily shamed if you feel shame if you transgress those norms.
Mm.
I think for masculine identities, not to be gender essentialist, but there are patterns across gender identities. For more masculine identity, shame really falls along the lines of weakness and vulnerability and the expression of emotions. So those are the kind of trigger points for shame more frequently. Um, and then, of course, shame is like really linked to social disadvantage. So there's a lot of shame around poverty, around other experiences like addiction, low literacy, stigma, anything infectious disease. So there are things that society has deemed to be bad or inappropriate or a signal that someone is flawed or has a flawed identity, and shame will kind of pool at the feet of those people more than others. Um,
Mm.
and I'm not suggesting that people have any reason to feel shame. Often shame is unjust and structural, so people are made unjustly and unfairly to feel like they're flawed or bad or not appropriate.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a big problem. That's how shame becomes a political emotion and an
Mm.
emotion of social control.
Mm. Yeah, I'm very curious about going into the political aspect of all this in a minute. But before, I would love to know more about all that shame that I feel as a woman we have a generational shame that just
Mhm.
was kind of coming with us as a lineage kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe can you explain a little bit more? Is there something that we subconsciously are not even aware of? What kind of shame, um, shames we got with our family history?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think there is some writing about transgenerational shame. So if you
Uh
live
huh.
in a household which is like marked by shame dynamics, then you'll learn those dynamics and move them on, and you inherit those things from caregivers and family members. I mean, I think in terms of femininity and the experience of women or female gender, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, as from Simone de Beauvoir's work, The Second Sex, she talks about how a woman becomes a woman through a process of shame. So you learn to start to see yourself as though through someone else's eyes, you're scrutinized and judged based on your appearance and how feminine you are. You see yourself as an object for others, for the male gaze. And so it's like part of how we're socialized as girls and women is to see ourselves through that kind of shaming gaze. And then
Mm-hmm.
we internalize that and evaluate ourselves in the same way. So it's very normal, and it's probably heightened by living in a really image saturated society, constantly seeing images of what we should look like or how we should be. Um, but that's certainly, I think, passed down culturally. It's not just like it doesn't just appear in our generation. It's a kind of cultural residue that we build on and live with.
Uh-huh. And I mean, where's that shame and that values that were passed along? Where's that coming from? Because I feel that, especially also, I'm half German, half Spanish, and like my Spanish side is very well, like in Spain, the the major religion is Catholicism, and the north of Germany is more Protestant, and I can really see the a little bit of a different aspect of what's right and wrong, and I feel like in the Catholic Church is a very like Virgin Maria is like
Yeah,
the
ideal
the
woman.
yes, exactly. And then anything that's not a virgin is the sexual being, and that's just more like the prostitute and like just everything in between. It's just a very weird thing. And I don't know, past generations, where maybe there was a single mom or divorce or something. It's just this heavy weight on the shoulders, and I wonder where this whole shame is coming from on an individual level and also on a collective level.
Yeah, I guess as we're saying, like, shame is I would say, a universal human experience. So we all have the capacity for shame. Some people suggest that maybe like psychopaths have less shame, or people with severe mental disorders might have less shame. But it's a kind of universal human experience. And really, what it is, it's the capacity to see yourself through someone else's eyes and sort of judge yourself according to a standard
Mhm.
or a norm or a rule or something.
Okay.
So this is a kind of universal experience. We're going to experience shame, and actually social theorists talk about shame as being the master emotion, because through shame experiences or negative self-conscious experiences, we learn social norms. We learn what's right or wrong or appropriate or inappropriate, and therefore we learn how to fit in and stay in our social group. And if we didn't have those experiences, we wouldn't survive, because we're social animals and we need others to look after us in order to survive. And the threat in shame is the threat that you'll be rejected or ostracized, and therefore you won't survive. So it's like a really primal emotion about survival. So shame is kind of always there. What might trigger shame can vary from culture to culture. And I agree that like maybe like judo creates Christian religion
Mm,
would heavily influence like the norms in European contexts about what's shameful and what's not. Like nudity is shameful, sex is shameful, illness is shameful, any kind of frailty or vulnerability is often considered shameful or stigmatizing. We don't want to admit to those sorts of things. But it's profoundly contextual and also contingent. Like there is no absolute truth about what's shameful or what's not. We kind of construct that in society. And then we also know that norms can change. So in certain cultures, being homosexual, for instance, being in a same-sex relationship was like so taboo, was even criminalized and so shameful. And now in many cultures, you can be married and out and proud, and nobody's worried about it. And so the norms have changed, not everywhere, obviously. And like breast cancer used to be hugely stigmatized and carry lots of shame, and now because of public campaigns to change the norms, you can talk about having breast cancer and nobody is worried about it, especially in the UK context. So there's so many factors that
mm,
will come, and it can vary from like family to family, from society to society, from community to community. It can be shaped by religion or culture, ethnicity, the kind of community groups you belong to. So there's no like one formula for like this is shameful and this isn't because
yeah,
it's profoundly contextual for different people, and what
yeah,
might be deeply shameful for you might not even be mildly embarrassing for
mm,
me, or something that happens at work might be like really like if I don't know my trousers fell down at work, it would be humiliating, but if it happened at home I wouldn't even worry because I'd
yeah.
be with my partner and my family. So that it's also deeply contextual. The same event could elicit a totally different response in different contexts. So it's a really slippery emotion. Like theorists talk about it as mercurial, and it's really changeable because it's really hard to pin down
Mhm.
exactly what it is and exactly when it happens and exactly why it happens. It's a challenging thing to research.
Yeah, yeah. No, it really does sound like that. What comes after shame? So when we experience shame, how does that affect our behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, profoundly contextual.
Mm.
Depends. So sometimes we can experience shame,
Mm-hmm.
and feel the experience, understand it, process it, metabolize it, and kind of move on. But because shame is taboo and psychologically quite threatening, often we need to defend ourselves from shame.
Mm,
And there's a psychiatrist called Donald Nathanson who has written a lot about shame, and he devised this thing called the shame compass, where he talks about four common patterns of behavior that we use to defend ourselves against shame. And they are this is a kind of modified version of his compass. It's attack other, attack self. So attack other would be like you lash out at someone, you get angry, you feel embarrassed, you shout at someone, you feel embarrassed or ashamed, so you are aggressive towards someone, and it's a way to like discharge the negative feeling by putting it on someone else. Or
mm-hmm.
self is like internalizing the negative feeling, and might be like self-hatred, self-deprecation, violence against the self like self-harm or even suicidal ideation. And then there's withdraw and disengage or deny. So that's where you hide, you don't disclose, you keep it secret, or you try and avoid the emotion through like distracting yourself, like numbing out or addiction. Different things might lead to avoidance or disassociating from the feeling. You just like
Mm,
really just don't feel it. And
right.
then compensates the other one where you Brene Brown talks about like perfectionism being related to shame. So your perfectionism is trying to stay two steps ahead of shame. So no
Mm,
one could ever accuse you of not being perfect. And so
yeah.
compensation is like perfectionism, overworking, narcissistic like traits, or grandiosity, where you just think you're so great and you project this kind of feeling of greatness. So the thing is that you can go anywhere on the compass, and where you go when you're trying to defend yourself against shame just again depends on personality or context or history. Um, And so if you can just experience shame and sort of process it, metabolize it, maybe talk about it, it might lead to growth. It might lead to like personal growth or change. If you're defending yourself against shame and ending up on the compass, it probably will lead to some sort of harm, like disconnection from others. Like shame is talked about as a pro-social emotion because we need it to create society. It's the kind of glue that holds society together. It teaches us norms, but
Right.
it can be profoundly antisocial. So sometimes it does lead to connection and belonging and growth, but when we're defending ourselves against shame in an unhealthy way, it can be antisocial and lead to disconnection and estrangement and secrecy and withdrawal and isolation, so it really depends. It's yeah. And some people are more shame resilient than others insofar and I don't like the term resilience, but shame resilience is used to mean that you can experience shame and it doesn't derail you or it is
Mm,
a destructive emotion. And often people who are already marginalized or stigmatized um, are are more shame prone, so they're more likely to be negatively affected by shame or more
mm,
susceptible to feeling shame because they're already feeling like they're positioned in society as worth less than others, or already positioned in a way that they're under more scrutiny or judgment.
mm. Okay, are there any other factors that make us be more likely to experience and feel shame?
Again, I think it's personal, like trauma and shame are really linked. So if you've experienced trauma, um, in like adverse childhood experiences, or neglect or mistreatment in early life, that often sets up a feeling of badness inside the self that carries on through life. Children who are mistreated or experience abuse or trauma often can't blame caregivers because caregivers are like little gods in their world. So they blame themselves, and that internalized blame and badness can set up an experience of chronic shame throughout life. And there's a great book by Patricia DeYoung, she's a psychotherapist, called Understanding and Treating Chronic Shame. And she talks about that, how relational trauma or experiences of abuse or trauma can set up like a lifelong kind of experience of shame.
Wow.
Yeah, and then that relates to experiences like marginalization, stigmatization, feeling like an outsider, being positioned that so you never feel like you quite fit in or belong. Um,
Mm.
mhm.
What about sexual assault when yeah, when
Yeah,
you
I mean, I think that would
Mhm.
fall under the umbrella of trauma, but also there's
Yeah.
something so taboo around sexual assault
Yes.
and admitting it, and then being it's shameful to be a victim. There's also
Mhm.
the like this kind of societal message that we get over and over again that it was probably your fault because you were drinking or your skirt was too short. There's this like victim blaming that is still so prevalent. And so that creates shame as well because there's a feeling of like, well, maybe I was responsible. I'm at fault. So I
Mhm.
think it's steeped. And then in services, how people are, especially in the UK, where if you report sexual assault, it's so unlikely that it will lead to some sort of prosecution for the perpetrator. So
Wow.
then that's all steeped in shame as well. Like there
Mm.
isn't justice. There's a feeling of, well, I'm not worth my life and my harm isn't worth anything because nothing's happening as a result of this. So that's also very shaming. Mhm.
Right. Right. And what about the like moving into the little bit more political aspect? And because you also, when we were prepping, you mentioned a few more systemic factors of shame. Can you
Yeah.
explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess shame is a political emotion. There's a really brilliant book by David Keane that was published last year called Shame, the Power and Politics of an Emotion. And he talks about how shame is kind of operating in global politics. So you can think about it like the idea of saving face is a very common trope that comes up in politics where nation states or politicians don't want to feel like they're losing face or they're going to be
Mm.
disrespected. And that drives decision making and behavior on a kind of political sphere. But shame is also like a big factor in social politics. So when you think about oppression, and I'm writing a book right now about structural shame. So thinking about how certain groups are positioned in society to be more likely to be the recipients of shame and shaming. So they're
Mm.
positioned as worth less than others. Like in the UK, that would be like refugees. They don't have the same status. They don't have the same rights. They might not be afforded, or they're not afforded privileges or care. So they're literally treated as though they're not worth as much as someone like me who has the rights and status. Um, so there are certain groups, and then this can fall along the lines of gender or race or sexuality or ethnicity. And it's not that the person themselves has anything to feel shame about, but that they're positioned as shameworthy by certain norms or structures
Mhm.
within society. And then it becomes an emotion of social control, because when you use shame, people want to avoid shame at all costs. So if you're weaponizing shame, it means that you can get people to do things that they might not want to do, or try and be a certain way, even if it's not in line with who they really are. Um, so there are lots of like political dimensions to shame, even though we experience it as a kind of individual,
Mm.
personal emotion. It feels like it's just my problem and it's just my fault and it's just me experiencing this. It's very often connected to bigger, like social patterns and norms. And I think one of the really empowering things when you're experiencing shame is to reflect on whether it's like, oh, is it my fault? Like, is there something really that I could change? Like, I've made a mistake or I've done something terrible. Okay, maybe I've made a mistake and I need to kind of work on myself and change. And often, what it's not that. Often, it's like I feel shame because there's some unfair standard or in the world that is making me feel like I'm not good enough. But actually, there's nothing wrong with me. So, like beauty norms and women, like all
Mm.
bodies are fine, but we're all constantly positioned to feel like it's not enough, it's not good enough. And it's really hard, even as a feminist philosopher, I still am affected negatively by beauty norms and still feel like inadequate. So
Mm.
it's like you can't just like go, oh, I don't agree with that. It's so deeply ingrained in how we understand ourselves and our identities.
So, how do we firstly become aware of that shame? Because I think sometimes it's so hidden. It's what you were saying. Oh, it's so ingrained in us that it's just so hard to actually see. Oh, this is I'm feeling ashamed of this, or yeah, I'm ashamed of not fitting in there or here, or so. How do we gain awareness of this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think you're right. It gets so invisibilized, and I think things, like body shame, which are just so pervasive and so normal, just
Mhm.
become like part of the background of your experience, so they don't even stand out as like, "Oh, that's" feeling inadequate all the time is just normal, so you don't
Yeah,
even realize that, right,
same.
cannot feel
We're the
inadequate all
same.
the time. So yeah, so it can be like it's like consciousness raising. You have this kind of
Mhm.
process of realizing that something is unfair, unjust, or is disadvantaging you in some way, and it
Yeah.
and like yeah, it sometimes can be very hard to even notice because it becomes the kind of tacit
Mhm.
norm of the. But then in other cases, there are really clear, like when I mentioned refugees, like it is really clear that there is a set of norms that are very, especially in the UK, that are very shaming towards immigrants or migrants or refugees. So, and are very explicit about them not being worth as much as the rest of us and not belonging. I mean, I'm an immigrant, I'm not English or British, but so there are very like overt um instances of this, but they sometimes also get very normalized. So you just think, well, that makes sense that we don't treat them as full humans. Um, and that's really dangerous, right? So it does sometimes take a bit of work to even see those kind of sites of oppression and structural shame.
Yeah,
Mhm.
because what? How do they? How does structural shame happen? What? How do they marginalize certain um groups of people, and how do we
Mhm.
slip into those?
Yeah, I think there are big dominant frameworks that govern Western or East European society in the present days, and those are things like patriarchy, um, the logics of colonialism, so like, and white supremacy, like white people are somehow better than people from colonies, or they're like deep logics that kind of shape ableism, like able-bodied people are somehow better than non-able-bodied people. So these like deep logics that really shape what we think is common sense or logical in the present day, and they're historical, right? So it's like a cultural history that just is carried through generations. So it does take quite a bit of work to even see those logics, because they're so deeply embedded into our laws, into our institutions, into our common sense thinking. So and they can be changed. So it's not,
Yeah.
these norms aren't fixed or true or necessarily right. But I think that's so the structural shame often comes from those legacies. So, like, women are the second sex, is what Simone de Beauvoir said. And that's like a legacy of patriarchy where women were seen as inferior because of, it used to be biological determinism. Well, their brains are smaller and they're not as strong as men. Therefore, they shouldn't be in the workplace and they shouldn't ever go to university. They shouldn't vote. So there's these kind of really deterministic ideas about humans and different types of humans based on gender or skin color or where you originate from in the world or so on, that still have a legacy. Like, even if we know women aren't
Mhm.
inferior, then but they still earn less, are still more likely to quit their jobs after they have children, or still, there's still all
Yeah.
these inequalities that are based on gender,
Yeah.
and are carried through law. Like in the UK, men don't get the same amount of paternity leave as women. The statutory maternity pay is really poor, so it's really hard to keep your job after you have a child, and all of these things that mean that leaves you really disadvantaged in social life. And that's a legacy of like, oh, well, women should just be homemakers because they're not the same as men in some
Mm,
way. So yeah, it's these kind of deep legacies of norms that come from these big systems that we've kind of
mm.
created society through.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like there's this polarization right now that's even moving us a bit even stronger towards that extremism again. And at the same time, there's also another wave of new consciousness and
Mhm.
just awareness and just bringing up these topics and just talking about those, right? So, what do you feel? Where are we, and why is like this? Movement again like so strong and trying to pull us back into history, into like these old dogmas?
Yeah,
Is it
it's a good
fear
question.
of?
I think, like, David Keane's book, which is about shame and politics, is really elucidating on this point. And I think that a lot of the kind of reactionary right wing
Mhm.
politics, that's like, it is fear based, but it's also shame based. And it's often shame defenses are driving the sort of politics that people might adopt. So he has a couple of chapters in his book about Trump and Trumpism, and talks about like working class Americans who
Mhm.
white working class Americans who've been told their whole lives, like, you're living the American dream, you can achieve anything you want, opportunity, the American dream is that you can become a millionaire, anyone can do it. But actually the reality of life is like struggle and hardship and poverty, because there aren't opportunities and there are all these structural barriers that mean people can't achieve the American dream.
Yeah.
And that's shameful. And so there's lots of literature about how when one group feels shame, they need to find another group below them to say it's their fault and they're worse than us, so they're less than us. And that
Right.
that kind of shame defense is like, it's the kind of attack other response. It's like saying, I'm elevating myself by putting someone down below me. So then it's like, well, it's the immigrant's fault that I'm in this position, or it's like whatever ethnic minority's fault that I'm in this position. So it becomes a way to deflect the blame, and also to try and make sense of something that might be causing a sense of inadequacy. And yeah, there are people writing about these kind of dynamics, like how humiliation can drive fury and rage. There's a kind of rage shame cycles that can drive certain types of behaviors as well. And so humiliated fury is another concept that's talked about in these in resentment politics, send to other groups because they're perceived to be taking social goods away from them. So definitely, like, there's really important stuff to be uncovered on that emotional or affective level to understand people's
Mhm.
decision making, because it often looks like the politics is like against their own best interests. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that's, I think, very interesting about shame, that we'll do anything to defend ourselves against shame because it's so painful and difficult. And often we'll do things that will even hurt or harm ourselves so we can make decisions that look really illogical or don't really make sense or add up.
Yeah.
And that's because shame is a primal emotion. It's not a rational experience. It's like, it's about
Mm,
survival. So sometimes we can do things that look illogical, irrational to
mm,
try and survive in the way that makes sense to us.
Gosh, it's fascinating. And so, yeah, we barely talk about it. It's just really fascinating that like so much is moved by shame, and then we barely talk about this. So what do we do to gain awareness? Because I also feel that shame is then so related to fear and pain, and so painful maybe to look at.
Mhm.
um so how do we break the cycle? How do we actually speak about it and maybe look at the pain or the fear that we have?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, um, socially, like
Hmm.
societally and culturally, having more open conversations about shame. I think Brené Brown, who's kind of American social worker in Texas who has popularized shame and vulnerability and written lots of books that are bestsellers. And her work's great because she's just like made like destigmatize the word shame. It's like we can talk about shame. We can talk about shame in relation to vulnerability. And I think
Mm,
more of that kind of pop culture work that just speaks very frankly and openly about these experiences is important because then that gives people the vocabulary and the concepts to use to think about their own experience. Um, and and then like one of the things I've been doing as an academic is I delivered trainings about shame, which sounds a bit weird, but what I call shame competence. I work with a colleague at Duke University in the States, and we teach shame and its effects to people working in service professions, so like healthcare, policing, social work, because what shame has a huge impact on the way people access services. So someone might not go to a doctor because they feel ashamed about their body, their illness, or about low literacy, or about poverty, or about addiction. So
yeah.
is a concrete barrier for people accessing services and can affect social and health outcomes. Or people might
Wow.
feel shamed by services. And yeah, so we're on a kind of mission to destigmatize shame and also get people really speaking openly about it to help improve how people receive care from services, but also how professionals work and how they understand shame in their workplace. So I think all of these kind of efforts to just bring the topic into a general conversation and speak openly about it are really important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And how is that workshop that you're doing? Like what kind of things are you teaching?
Yeah, cool. It's a good question. So we set up this thing called the Shame Lab, which is where we run these trainings, and what we teach are things like how to what shame is. So we do psychoeducation around shame. So we talk about why we experience shame, define it as a negative self-conscious emotion, talk about the difference between acute and chronic shame, and the difference between shame and guilt, things like that. So just trying to get a deeper understanding of what shame is. So it's a very complex and nuanced experience with lots of forms and shows up in lots of different ways. We look at how shame is often hidden by other experiences. I talked about the shame compass. So what we often experience when we're encountering other people is not their shame, but their defense against shame. So you might, if you're a doctor shouting at you, chances are lashing out because they feel embarrassed or disrespected or humiliated. So it's like learning to see behind these surface behaviors to the emotional distress that might be driving them. And it's a really helpful tool when you're working with children or you're working with vulnerable populations or clinical populations. We teach how to respond to shame. So if you suspect someone's experiencing shame, like how can you be sensitive to their experience? We teach about the connections between shame and power, shame and hierarchy. We teach about shame cycles, like shame violence cycle, shame disengagement cycle. Um, we teach about shaming and how shaming is often embedded into policies and practices in organizations, and it's used as a tool, like in public health, it's used as a tool in criminal justice. And people think, and kind of intuitively, it makes sense that, like, if you shame someone on purpose, it'll stop them doing the bad thing that they're doing, or it might help them
Mhm.
change behavior, might help them quit smoking or lose weight or whatever. There's so much evidence that that just doesn't work. And actually, when you shame someone, it often leads to defensive behavior. That means that they just disengage or withdraw, or they act out even more, like it entrenches the bad behavior. But nonetheless, it's still used all the time. Like in the UK during COVID, loads of the public health campaigns were shame and guilt based campaigns to, like, feel bad in order to get them to comply to rules. And then there was evidence later that those campaigns weren't effective. And then we also teach about how shame is sort of cultural, societal, and also in organizations. So how it can be embedded in organizations through hierarchy, through unprofessional behaviors like bullying, um, and then how it's linked to psychological safety. So there's a whole kind of gamut
Wow.
of things. We teach
Wow.
people to recognize their own shame, because I think the thing about shame is, like, we all experience it. So even if you're like a high powered professional with lots of status, you are still a human who can experience this emotion. And
Yeah.
because the relational emotion, it often moves between people. We feel shame in front of someone and
Yeah.
or with someone. So just understanding how, your role as a professional, just being a professional, can incite shame in the vulnerable
Mm.
person coming to you for your expertise and advice and feels judged and scrutinized by you. So, like, yeah, we just sort of shine a light on these really basic human things that we all experience and know about, but no one's actually articulated. So,
No, that's
yeah.
so important. And yeah, it's such a beautiful work that you're doing because yeah, it's definitely so much needed. I mean, creating a safe environment for people to be able to share where they're ashamed or feel shame. Very beautiful. Can you share a bit more about the shaming aspect? Because I think it's very interesting because maybe a lot of us would think, yes, shaming works sometimes. And it totally makes sense that it doesn't because it kind of is that fear-based response, right? But what else can we do then?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, like, it is true that shaming does sometimes work. And I think, intuitively it feels right. Like, if someone's doing something bad in your community, you want to shame them and call them out and, like, point it out so they'll stop. And I think intuitively it's like it kind of makes sense.
Mm,
Problem is we just don't know how shame will land on a person. So, like, some people would be like, "Oh yeah, I did something bad. I'm going to learn and grow and change," and that's a positive outcome. But for many people, it, like I said, it would lead to defensiveness or lashing out, or, some bad behavior like withdrawal or disengagement, losing trust in the community, and so on. And then if it's ever used across a population, like if you're using it in a public health campaign, so you want people to stop smoking, so use a shaming campaign, like shame
mm,
them smokers. Maybe like 1 out of 10 people will respond well to that, and maybe 9 out of 10 will be defensive. So because you can't predict how it will
mm,
land on a population, I think, and I'm not the only person to argue this, it should never be used across a population. So we should never use it intentionally as a punishment or as a behavior change tactic. Um, but so it can sometimes work. It does sometimes work. And it often works for people who are um, very, like, secure in themselves,
mm,
aren't vulnerable, aren't, living with trauma, aren't marginalized, aren't already living with structural shame. So it might work for really kind of solid people who might learn something from a shame experience. Um,
mm,
and then I think there are other ways to motivate behavior, like behavior change campaigns. You can look at campaigns that motivate people by thinking about community and belonging. So, like,
mm,
you want to get closer to your community, so you get vaccinated rather than shame on you for not getting vaccinated. You want to protect your community rather than saying you're not going to be part of our community.
mm,
And I think there's a really important distinction that a criminologist called John Braithwaite makes, which is the difference between stigmatizing shame and reintegrative shame. So stigmatizing shame is you shame someone and then they're outcast. So they're, like, pushed out of the community. They're stigmatized and othered.
yeah.
that's destructive. And so then reintegrative shame is where you use shame to teach someone a lesson, but then bring them back into the fold and they're reintegrated into the
Mm,
community. And the problem is obviously when you're mobilizing shaming is that you just don't know how it's going to be experienced.
right.
Is it gonna be, yeah, which way it's going to
Yeah.
go.
Because like how do you do the one or the other? How do you reintegrate someone after shaming?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you like, the problem is we lived in such a big connected world with the
Yeah.
online world as well. So if you think like if you had a pre-internet tiny village where shame was
Okay.
used because someone stole something, you shamed them, but then you had a meeting and everyone came together and said, "But you still belong here, and we're still going to keep you in our community." That could be a reintegrative experience. They felt bad, they learned, they're brought back into the fold, and maybe
Right.
they will do it again. And like
Right.
theorists have talked about how shame is just completely transformed now because we've got online spaces. So shame, when you do online shaming,
Mm,
it's not geographically bounded. It's not held within a community. It
mm,
has a different temporality. It'll last forever potentially. Like you can't ever move away from the shaming. You move to another city, it's still with you. You know, so it's like the
right.
kind of nature of shaming is different, and it can be weaponized so
Uh-huh.
much more because you can create a pylon through social media where you shame someone for something and then suddenly 100,000 people are also shaming them and then they lose their job and then they lose their partner and then like and
Yeah.
the effects of a transgression can be so much more than if
Mm,
it's just like something your neighbors saw you do. You know what I
yeah.
mean? So,
Yeah.
so there's like a totally different way shaming has is playing out in our kind of online offline
Mm,
world these days. And it can be
yeah.
more like really more destructive as a result because of its reach and the scale of it. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. Yeah. It's so true. It's like a whole nother dimension of it. Yes. Um, Something that has recently surprised you doing the research, whatever it is related to shame, something surprising for you.
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. Yeah, I guess it's something, I guess, well, maybe less the research, but more like delivering training to professionals, which is a sort of
Mm,
relative new thing for me, is how infrequently people have thought about shame as like if you're police officer or a healthcare worker or social worker and you're coming into contact with vulnerable populations. In my head, obviously, because I'm a shame researcher and have been thinking about it for over 20 years, it seems really obvious to me that shame would be a huge part of that interaction. And
yeah.
what keeps surprising me is that for most of the people who come along to these trainings or who I give talks to, they've never thought about it before. You know what I mean? And it like blows my
Yeah.
mind. And then once they see it, it's like they're like, "How did I not see this before?" And
Yes.
like this police officer who is the one who got me into the Devon and Cornwall Police to deliver training, she was a police officer for 20 years on the street and working in serious violence prevention. And then she retired and came back as a specialist problem solver. And I sent her, not my research, some research about the links between shame and violence. There's this American psychiatrist called James Gilligan, who worked for 30 years in the Massachusetts prison system. He's a psychiatrist at Harvard. And he wrote a book called Violence. And his central thesis in the book is that there is no act of violence that doesn't have shame at its root cause. So for all the violent criminals he worked with, their violence was driven by humiliation, by disrespect, by feeling less than, by feeling unworthy, by not being loved. So
Mm,
the violence came out of shame. And he was like, I can't find an example where the violence isn't because of shame. and she read one of his papers that I sent her, and it like literally blew her mind. She's like, I worked for 20 years in serious violence prevention. Nobody ever mentioned shame as a driver of violence. Like nobody ever mentioned it. And his work is from the 90s. It's not like, new work. And it just surprises me how we know this stuff, but it's not seeping into kind of common understandings. And she said to me, like, if I had known this, I would have done everything differently because I was using shame as a tool to motivate people to stop being criminals or to stop their bad behavior. And obviously that was just going to backfire because you're already talking about people whose behavior is driven by shame for reasons probably related to abuse or trauma or so I think that's one of the things I found really surprising is how poorly understood this is when it's as you were saying, like, it's everywhere. It's driving all this stuff, but we're not talking about it.
Yeah, that's so
And that's just
fascinating.
one example. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's just when you say it like this, it's so obvious that um I don't know, treating someone with um kind of the punishment of no love,
Yeah.
um that is already coming from no love is just completely counterproductive. I mean, it just makes so much sense when you say it like this.
Yeah.
And I think it's yeah, I think there's this idea of I don't know, being naive or being very I don't know, well-hearted or something if you just well, let's just try to listen and try to kind of be open and giving some sort of safe space and love and to like the bad actions. It's just like you know, it's kind of I don't know from the what I've heard around me that's usually kind of like this is the false response to something like this,
And there's a
right?
lot and totally and I think, like, working with the police here in where I live in Devon, I mean, I had stories of people saying, if I'm nice to, like a police officer saying, if I'm kind to a homeless person, I get shouted out by a member of the public who's telling me I shouldn't, you shouldn't encourage that kind of behavior. So there's like a lot of public pressure to punish and
Mm.
there's a kind of hunger for shame and punishment in our culture. um, and yeah, so it's a really difficult force to fight against, I think, because people feel like certain people don't deserve to be treated well, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. No, and I think what also what you said about shame, just the base of all these other behaviors. Yeah, I think it's such a correlation because what we are more used to maybe is guilt or fear or pain, but
mhm.
shame is not that common.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not openly acknowledged, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly,
Mm.
exactly. Where do you see us moving within shame development, maybe within like the next 5 to 10 years or something?
That's a good question. Like, to be honest, there are a lot of in my world, which is academic philosophy in the academic world, I see a lot more writing and research around shame, and like quite a few
Nice.
books have been published in recent times about shame. So I think that's great. Like the cultural discourse is increasing.
Mhm.
The work I'm doing with the Shame Lab and my colleague Will Bynum at Duke University, like we're hoping to keep teaching people about shame, professionals in particular, and bring a kind of understanding of shame into professional practice. So much like in professional practice, people would think about equality, diversity, and inclusion, or they would think about psychological safety or dignity being important in the workplace. We think that people should also be thinking about shame and shame competence in the workplace, and that it should be an international standard for professional practice. Like all healthcare workers should learn about shame, be able to recognize it in their patients, be able to set up their clinics so shaming isn't happening accidentally,
Mm,
likewise, policing and so on. So I think like bringing more awareness and understanding in general to
mm,
shame at work and in personal life, I think is can be really transformative. Because then you
mm,
can start to resist. You can start to resist the unfair shaming, the structural shaming. You can start to point it out and say, actually, that's not okay. And it
mm.
doesn't stay invisibilized.
Yeah. Yeah, because that goes hand in hand, no? This like not talking about it and then it's even more shame.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's even more taboo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's like, I mean, Brené Brown says, like, what if you shine a light on shame, that's the thing that can dissolve it or,
Mm,
make like take away its power is just talking about it openly. And that's on an individual level. If you can have a conversation with a trusted friend about or a family member about your shame experiences,
yeah.
that can really alleviate the distress. But even societally and culturally, if we can have these conversations, that can also alleviate the power it has.
Mhm. Mm, beautiful. And how would you say that what kind of world would we live in if there was not such a massive shame experience? Mhm.
Well, shame is inevitable, so I'm not gonna say we're gonna eliminate it. It's kind of necessary for social life, but I think if we lived in a world where it was a more constructive and pro-social experience and people were supported and looked after, um, then that would be very different than the society I think we live in right now, where there's a lot of unspoken, destructive, antisocial shame circulating, especially in online spaces, where it's like weaponized to harm, really. So I think, yeah, I think it would be a better place where people could flourish more and feel more sort of acceptance and belonging. And it really is at the heart of injustice and oppression,
Mm,
like racism and discrimination and minoritization is all about finding a group of people and saying, "You're not as good as us, you're worth less than us. There's something flawed or wrong with you, and therefore we're gonna treat you bad." And that's shame, right? That's saying you're a shamed population.
yeah,
Um, and if we can get rid of that, that would transform everything.
right. Yeah, that would be a very beautiful world to see. I mean, I always ask this question as like one of the ending questions. What is the new world in the making for you? Since
Mhm.
the podcast is called like that. Would that be the new world in the making?
Yeah, a shame competent world would be for
Mhm.
me. So a world where we all have this kind of understanding and awareness of these experiences, and can respond sensitively to shame, can recognize shame, can turn it from a negative experience into a pro-social experience where we're creating more inclusion, more dignity, more belonging, more acceptance, across the board on all levels, from individual interactions to like societally. Mhm.
Beautiful. And so, what can we learn from that?
What do
What
you
do
mean?
you what would you say we could learn from growing that shame awareness on the path of going to that new world?
I think like one of the big lessons is that we're all humans and
Right.
on some level just all having the same experience. You know, there's something the same in all of us, and that should be honored and valued, and we all deserve respect and dignity. And um, yeah, and that somehow just gets forgotten so easily.
So true. So true. Yeah, it's very connecting, no? Like it's
Yeah,
like very connecting as like a very human, yeah, aspect of all of us.
yeah, absolutely.
So someone that wants to be a bit more aware about their shame, what would you suggest they would do?
Yeah, I mean, I would watch Brené Brown's TED Talks. She's got a few really, really famous one where she talks about vulnerability and shame, and I think that's really motivating for a lot of people. Has been quite inspirational for a lot of people. Um, there's lots of writing about shame these days, and you can look if you just Google like if you're interested in shame and trauma or shame and racism or I think looking around online, you'll find lots of writing. You can visit the Shame Lab, my initiative with my colleague at Duke, where we're doing research around shame in professional practice and doing training. So that's shamelab.org if you want to visit our website and have a look around. Um, yeah, and just be aware of it more and
Yeah,
start to see it and be like patient and empathic and curious about these experiences. Mhm.
beautiful. Okay, I will also put all the links down in the description so
Sure.
everyone can have a look. And just to finish, I always finish with a question. So if you could leave a question, reflection for all the listeners to reflect upon, which one would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess like how has shame showed up for you in your life, and is it something that you've thought about before? Just a kind of self-reflection, turning inwards. Because if we want to understand other people's shame, we really need to understand our own as well. So yeah,
Wow, that's a very powerful question. Yeah. Thank you so much, Luna. This was really very enlightening. And yeah, thank you very much.
yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and it's lovely to chat to you.
You too. Thank you.